All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica McCoubry, and this is the science of prairie dogs today. So we're going to be talking about the prairie dogs that we have in Nebraska and then also within the United States. So we'll mostly be focusing on the species that we have here in the state just because that's where we are. But we will also be talking about other things as well. We have a lot to get through today, so this is the last science of, and I just kept finding more information that I wanted to share with all of you. So it'll be a little, we'll try and keep it to that 45 minutes, but it might be like 50 or 53 minutes. So we'll see today. So I will try and keep my best to do that, but there's just so much information that I wanted to tell people. So, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen for all of you to talk about prairie dogs. All right. Okay. All right, so today we're talking about prairie dogs. Just to let everybody know, very excited about this one. Lots of cool information. Just a heads up to everyone, this one I guess doesn't really matter today since the chat is disabled and the mute or you can't talk. So you'll just have to listen to me whether you like it or not. So, all right. So just giving you one a heads up as well, I am by no means a prairie dog expert. I have a lot of information. I've read a lot of papers. I do a lot of research. I ask a lot of questions to our biologists about these. So if something is, you have a question about something that I did not include and you want to ask me at the very end, I'll put in my email address for everybody. So if you have those questions, please ask me at the end. I am a science communication expert. I'm not a prairie dog expert, but I will find out those answers if you have those questions for me. So, all right. So like normal, we're going to talk about a little prairie dog evolutionary history here. So what are they? Where did they come from? They've been here as long as people have known, as at least here, the modern day people know prairie dogs pretty well in Nebraska. But where exactly did they come from? So that early evolutionary history that we're talking about. So they were very, very early members to this land mammal era, which was in the late Pliocene, which is about 3.6 to 2.6 million years ago. So they've been around quite a while. To be fair, prairie dogs are kind of in a Western United States kind of an area. There's a lot of studies that have been done on them, but there's also a lot of like scant fossil records of them. I feel like I say that every single time as we don't have a lot of information because we don't have good stuff in the fossil record. So that's just kind of how it goes. Some animals are more understood than others, but the fossil history for prairie dogs is pretty much best reconstructed for the Great Plains of the United States and also in Canada. However, it's really insufficiently studied for basically the Southwest and almost that entirely unknown area in northern Mexico. So there are a few species that we'll be talking about today that kind of reside in those areas. But overall, we're going to be talking about the black-tailed prairie dog, which we have here in Nebraska. So, but prairie dogs are rodents. So they are in actually the squirrel family. So like things like marmots and anything that you would kind of fit in those ground squirrels, squirrel type of era. So they look like fat little marmots, basically. That's pretty much what they are. But they're just a little bit different, but they reside in that squirrel family. So related to ground squirrels and closely related to North American and Eurasian ground squirrels. The fossils document their evolutionary history mostly in Western North America, basically since that late Pliocene epoch that we talked about earlier. So, so their origins, so that Sciuridae family, the squirrel family, about 30 to 20 million years ago is when we first have known about squirrel-like rodents. They kind of emerged in the Oligocene, the early Miocene. Fossil evidence that we do have for them kind of suggests that they were more ground-dwelling rodents. They were ancestors to prairie dogs, and then they adapted to more of a terrestrial and fossorial, which simply means burrowing lifestyle as those grasslands started to spread. So that ground squirrel evolution by the mid-Miocene, which is about 15 to 10 million years ago, ground squirrels really started to beginning to diversify into specialized burrowers. So we have this family of ground squirrels that is even more destined to be a ground dweller and also that burrower. And then you have the rise of the prairie dogs, which was about 5.7 million years ago. So it was during the late Miocene and that Pliocene epoch in the Great Plains. we're gonna let these people in here. During those drier climates, so there was this huge expansion of grasslands, and there was this niche that needed to be filled. And so prairie dogs were like, that's us. So that fossil record of early prairie dogs is pretty sparse, but there's molecular evidence that shows prairie dogs diverged from marmots and ground squirrels approximately 3 to 5 million years ago. And then the modern day prairie dog species that we have now, we talked about this a little bit ago, about 2.5 million to 12,000 years ago, the modern prairie dog that we know emerged. So fossil evidence of that Cynomys is their genus. So when you talk about prairie dogs, Cynomys, you might hear me say that a few times today. It has been found across North America, indicating this huge like ecological dominance in the grasslands. And that's where we find them today. All right, so I want to talk about the discovery of prairie dogs. And when I air quote here, I just want to make a quick note that prairie dogs, when European colonial people came over, they found prairie dogs, but they obviously were known way before that. So when I say the discovery of prairie dogs, it was clearly before Lewis and Clark came over. But we're going to talk about them today because that is the like written record that people have kind of gone off of these modern day prairie dogs. But again, there were people here long before we were, and they were clearly knowing that prairie dogs existed. They were a huge part of their culture. So I just wanted to give that a shout out here. They were long known before the discovery of them in 1804, but they get their name because of their habitat, that prairie area, and then dogs, as they have this kind of a sound that's very similar to a dog's bark. But when Lewis and Clark came over, they had journals and they kept journals, and in 1804 they actually discovered the prairie dog on September 7th. They discovered this prairie dog in this little village, was what they called it. They found this animal that lived in this village and they called it a prairie dog. So it was a village of animals, and it was actually found in Boyd, what is now Boyd County, Nebraska. So we can say that we are contributing to the discovery of the prairie dog. So animals were seen sitting on top of these holes. They were in a hillside. They kept making these whistling noises, and they kept stepping into their holes when they were alarmed. So the expedition actually captured a prairie dog. They sent it back to the East Coast. Thomas Jefferson actually kept it for a while, kind of studied it a little bit, and then he gave it to Charles Wilson. Goodness. And then he actually had the display of that taxidermied animal at his museum in Philadelphia. All right, so that was like very basic prairie dog information here, but we're going to talk now a little bit more about their general information. So when we talk about prairie dog species, you heard me mention Cynomys. So that is their genus. When we talk about them, all of them have that same genus, but there are different species. So there's these colonial burrowing mammals, which means that they live in a group or a town. Sometimes people call them colonies. And it's pretty much restricted to that Western North America. So most well-known species is the one that we have here in Nebraska, which is the black-tailed prairie dog. However, there are other species. There's 4 other species currently described. There's the Mexican prairie dog, the white-tailed prairie dog, the Utah prairie dog, and the Gunnison's prairie dog, and then the black-tailed, so 5. They're also divided into groups. So to make it easier for people, they've divided them into the white-tailed group and into the black-tailed group. So prairie dogs in general, no matter what species they are, they have certain physical features. They're small, they have short tails, and then they are rodents. They have this kind of light brown fur for the most part, depending on the species and the environment that they are, but they blend in really well to the dirt on their mounds. They have short legs, they have strong claws to dig. The black-tailed prairie dog is named after the black tip that's on their tail, and then the white-tailed ones are named for the white tip that's on their tail. They have an average lifespan in the wild about 3 to 4 years. And then in the captivity, they can live up to 8 or even longer. There's really not much difference between a male and a female prairie dog. There's a small difference. Male is usually about 10 to 15% heavier than a female. And then they reach their heaviest weight in the wintertime. And then their smallest weight, their lowest weight is going to be in that winter time. And then their heaviest weights are going to be reached in that summer. All right, so here's just a quick video, and I'm sure all of us know what a prairie dog looks like. This one just kind of makes me laugh because it's like a mom, probably with a little baby prairie dog. Prairie dog baby's driving her nuts, chewing on its tail, her tail. But here's a little baby prairie dog. These prairie dogs look kind of rough. If you look at the older ones, the larger ones, it looks like they're missing pieces of fur. So I looked it up, and it looks like depending on the species and the individual, how much they eat, all that stuff, they can molt, and they do molt throughout the year. But also like going underground, they get scratched. They fight with each other in territory disputes. So there's lots of different reasons they could have some type of mange or anything like that. So they looked a little rough in this video. Here's one. You will not be able to hear it, but they are making a noise when you look at it on our YouTube. You'll be able to hear it, but one of the kind of distinctive features of prairie dogs is they make that noise, that kind of yip noise that you might hear quite a bit. And then also one more video. This is one that is on the lookout here. I like how still they are and how they just sit up on their hind legs, kind of smelling the air. And then you see this one off the corner in the left, like chewing and eating. So they're colonial animals. They live within groups, and they each have kind of their own role. And we'll talk about that later. All right, so we talked in earlier that they are kind of divided into the black-tailed group and the white-tailed group. So all prairie dogs kind of share this common physiology, biology, ecology. There are differences within their behavior. So black-tailed prairie dogs, for instance, they do not hibernate. So the ones that we have here in Nebraska, you can still see in the winter, but they might not be as noticeable. White-tailed species do hibernate, or they go into something called torpor. The black-tailed prairie dogs, PD is prairie dogs, they do perform this kind of jump yip that a lot of other species do not perform. So when you see them, they'll kind of jump with their front feet and they'll yip. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but it's kind of a specific feature that they do, a characteristic that they do. And then black-tailed prairie dogs and Utah, the species Utah prairie dogs, they participate in something called allo-grooming, which is grooming each other in their community, and other species usually do not. There is things like alarm calls and territory calls. They also differ in their pattern and sometimes posture among the species, but overall there's like slight differences between that black-tailed group and that white-tailed group. All right, so here's a picture of a white-tailed prairie dog. Not going to notice much difference, except if you look at that tail, it's clearly pretty white. And then here's our black-tailed prairie dog. So very, very similar. It's just the tip of those tails, again, is how they get their name. All right, so geographic range. I didn't want to type out black-tailed prairie dog every single time, so I'm going to shorten it to BTPD. So if you see that, that means black-tailed prairie dogs. They have this really narrow band of short to mid-grass prairies, all the way from central Texas in the south to just north of the Canadian border. So they have quite the range within the state, or sorry, within the country. Their historical range was much greater. They used to be found from Nebraska in the east all the way to Montana in the west. And then they range from Canada in the north to Mexico in the south. There's been a lot of intensive efforts over time to eradicate these animals severely. They've reduced the species to a few isolated areas associated with protected land. So in Nebraska, for instance, we're 97% privately owned. There's a lot of prairie dogs on private land, so they're not necessarily on public land, but that's not necessarily the case for every single state either. So, and every species is a little different. So we'll talk about how they kind of fit and what regulations there are with them later too. So here's a range. It kind of goes by the type of animal or the species. So blacktails have this huge range, and then whitetails, Gunnisons, the Mexican prairie dogs, you can kind of see this little tiny area. They're not very well studied, but that is what they consider their range right now. So just kind of thinking about that, I bet you can kind of guess what their status is, whether they're at risk or threatened or endangered. And so we'll kind of talk about that later, but that's kind of the range of the species. And then these other species, they're found in distinctive regions. They can easily be identified pretty much geographically by looking at them. White-tailed prairie dog ranges extends all the way from central and southern Wyoming, northeastern Utah, northwest Colorado. The Utah prairie dog is found more in a limited range, basically southwest Utah only. And then that Mexican prairie dog we talked about, very not much studied, is found in a small geographic range, kind of in that north central Mexico. All right, so even though they do have different ranges, what does their habitat look like? So all prairie dogs, they like grassland habitats. When they are in a prairie, it is not just grasses. It's dominated by grasses, but there's also sedges, there's brush, there's flowering plants, there's woody plants, and sometimes there's even occasional trees. They really like areas that have grasses that are high in moisture content and nutrition value because that supplies their needs for energy and water. They also prefer to live in prairies with really low or short vegetation. If you think about it, prairie dogs are not very big and they stand on the ends of their mounds to look out for danger. If the grasses around their mounds are taller than they are, it's not going to be great for them to find danger or to see a predator coming. So sometimes they will even like clip or kind of landscape their little area just to make sure that they can see. They don't really eat what's around their colony or their burrow, but they clip the grass like a little lawnmower, and so they're able to see. And then also they really like native to short grass prairie habitats. They can be also found in urban, suburban, or even rural areas. In Nebraska, we kind of think about them more rural, but we went to Colorado Springs in October, and my mother-in-law had this pretty developed area that she was living in. And at this four-way stop, I kept seeing these little things pop up in like the middle of the city. And I was like, oh my God, those are prairie dogs. So you never really think about prairie dogs living in this urban area, but wherever they can find the space and wherever they have the correct habitat is somewhere they can live. All right, so they feed primarily on plants. They eat a variety of grasses and brush, cactus, seeds, thistles. They really select forbs, like I mentioned, those grasses that are high in moisture and nutrition value, just simply because they have a lot of those high maintenance needs. They will occasionally eat an insect or a worm, or if they see roadkill carrion, it can opportunistically be fed on. If you think about it, that's a very easy meal for a prairie dog, for any animal to find something that's already dead and it's right there. And so why waste it? And then why waste those calories and that energy as well? And then in addition, we also talked about this, they kind of clip the vegetation around their colony. They don't consume it, but they kind of lawnmower it or landscape it simply so that they can look out and make sure that they're on the hunt for predator. So they don't really eat a lot of meat. Mentioned a couple of times that they'll eat an insect or a worm or some roadkill, but it's really rare for them to eat a meat. However, sometimes there are some there's cannibalism that goes on. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But also thinking about it, when you talk about, wow, that's a lot of prairie dogs, they must eat a lot of grass. It takes about 250 prairie dogs to eat as much grass as one 1,000-pound cow. So 1,000-pound cow equals 250 prairie dogs. So that's just kind of the equivalent when we talk about, wow, prairie dogs, they must eat a lot of grass. Not anywhere close to our cattle. All right, so those that do hibernate, all species of the whitetail group spend their winter in deep torpor underground. Those prairie dogs that do hibernate, they lower their body temperatures and they have really slow metabolic processes. So their body is basically running slower so they don't burn as many calories. The blacktail in the Mexican group, prairie dogs do not hibernate in any part of their range. The blacktail prairie dogs do remain less active during those winter times. And then regardless of the species, it is important that they put on as much weight, whether they are hibernating or not, in the wintertime to help with overwintering and surviving just during that torpor. So whether they're hibernating or not, they have to eat a lot of food simply because a lot of the times, especially in Nebraska even, their food is covered in snow or it's simply there's nothing there. So they have to put on as much weight regardless if they're hibernating or not. All right, so that was kind of like basic prairie dog stuff. We're going to talk now about how they live in a colony and kind of their social aspect and their behavior. All right, so there's a lot of vocabulary that I'm going to throw at you, and I put this in maybe mostly for me because when I was writing all these notes, I was like, okay, what was that? So I had to go back and I made a vocabulary list and it helped me. So when we say prairie dog town or prairie dog colony, it's that entirety of an area. It's recognized by the mounds and the holes at their burrow entrances. So each town or colony can contain about 15 to 26 family groups. So it all just depends on the species, the range, the environment, how much space there is, all of those things. So So in the animal kingdom, you will see a lot of animals that do have this colony-based aspect. A lot of the times it's because of the seasons, the cooperation that they have. So it happens quite a bit in the animal kingdom. But then all species of prairie dogs live in colonies. But again, sometimes people call them towns. And then you're also going to have in those colonies or towns, you're going to have wards. So there's subgroups within a town, but they're separated by physical barriers like a hill or other topographical features. The size and the density of the wards really varies by the species and those environmental factors. So if they live in an area where there's a ton of like big brushy forbs, those might be the separations between those wards. So they're all the same colony, but it's like the suburbs. So you have all this huge city here, but then you have smaller little areas, but they're still all part of your town. And then you might hear me mention a coterie. That's the individual family groups. So the family groups within those wards, within those towns, they're made up of a few male adults, females, and they're young. And then the clan or the coterie sometimes is that kind of contiguous family group. And the home territory is where like majority of the prairie dogs, where they spend their time. All right, so that coloniality, when we talk about it, it's members of the same species that live close together and they interact. Typically, the colonies are divided by the landscape features, those wards that we talked about. Black-tailed prairie dogs, for example, they are found in colonies of the thousands, and they have many wards and many individual family groups within them. And then in other species, sometimes you might not hear the word coterie. They're called clans. I wish there was just like a standard operating, like this is what we call them. But again, it just depends on the species and also their geographic range. So when we think about a colony, there's definitely some advantages and disadvantages to living within a group. So some of those advantages, they're shared basically vigilance of their surroundings, and then that increased predator awareness. So if you're the only one there and you're the only one you're trying to eat, you're trying to take care of the kids, you're watching for predators, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So just being hyper aware. So you have 10 other people or 10 other prairie dogs in your area watching for predators while you grab a bite to eat, that makes more sense. That's a great advantage. There's also a lower chance of being targeted by a predator. So if a badger is around and there's 20 prairie dogs, he probably won't pick one off, or she probably won't pick one off because there's safety in numbers, as we always talked about. Something else is there's also another chance that a member will allocate more energy toward caring for your offspring. So if you're like, hey, Susan, can you watch my kid while I go talk to Bill over there? That is something that could absolutely happen. And then there's closer access to sexually receptive individuals during the mating season. So they have a very, very short time frame as a mating season. And if they don't meet that, they don't have that next generation. And then also thinking about the male doesn't have to go find a female. For instance, like mountain lions, they have to have this huge territory, and sometimes it's very hard to find a female. So this makes just more sense. There's disadvantages though. There's easier risk of spreading disease. There's risk of inbreeding. There's a higher potential mortality in numbers from single events. So if there's all of a sudden a tornado that wipes through, half your colony could be gone. However, there's also that competition for resources. So the space, there's food, there's mate competition. Sometimes that results in like aggressive interactions. And then sometimes there's also allocating energy to the care of an offspring that's not your own. So living in a colony, you might not be related to the kids that you're taking care of. So thinking about why should I allocate my energy towards that when they're not my offspring. So there's disadvantages and there's advantages to living in this colony. So within a colony, what are these characteristics? So prairie dogs are usually extremely social animals at every life stage. They're pretty peaceful for the most part. They're cooperative creatures, but there is hostility. It depends on the species, but some characteristics that are found in all species, they are pretty friendly. They also have something called a hostile kiss, which is they walk up to each other and they kind of like push their face in each other, but it's kind of hostile. They have territory disputes, they have alarm calls, there's sometimes contact fighting, there's play, there's chases, and they forage together for the most part. Certain species are more social than others. Black-tailed prairie dogs are very social, but then you have something like the Gunnison's prairie dog. They have a lot of solitary behavior as well. So again, you're having that disadvantage of living in that colony, but then also there's advantages as well. All right, so burrowing. So mounds of excavated soil around the burrow entrance are generally cone shaped. So when you see them in a prairie dog town, you will see these big mounds like this dog is standing in here. They're shaped kind of varied like a cone, and they're anywhere from 1 to 3 feet in diameter. The tunnels then are usually 3 to 6 feet below the surface, and they can be anywhere from like 15 feet long. Typical prairie dog town consists of groups that occupy and protect those small areas within the town. The residents of each coterie or family group, they protect the territory from intruders, including other prairie dogs and other coteries within the town. So just because you live in the same town as another prairie dog doesn't mean they're all going to be friends. These mounds kind of serve as their lookout point. So whenever you see a prairie dog town, you'll probably notice prairie dogs sitting on top of it. That's them kind of surveying their area. The burrow systems also have several chambers. So there's like a area where they can listen for activity. There's an area where there's a childcare area. There they have a bathroom area. They have an extra entrance and a escape route in case something would happen. So the largest prairie dog town that was on record was in Texas. It was 100 miles wide, 250 miles long, and it contained an estimated 400 million prairie dogs. So they can get rather large. That might not be something that we see now just because their historic range is a little larger than it is today. But here is a drawing example of what the below the surface of a prairie dog burrow or town looks like. So they have their entrances. They have anywhere from at least 2 up to 6. But they also have like a listening chamber. Notice how it's really close to the top. So if a predator comes up by that raised burrow, they're going to hear and be able to alert the rest of the colony. They have a nursery chamber. They have a bedroom chamber. They have a toilet chamber. They have a food cache. So they have kind of this little space for everything. It's like your underground house. So it is rather put together when we talk about it. It's not just random burrows that don't go anywhere. All right, so those burrow functions, they're usually U-shaped like we just saw. They have multiple chambers that are connected by those tunnels. This is kind of everything I just told you. They have those entrances, which are really important. If you have one entrance and one exit, that something's going to happen. So you have up to at least 2, up to 6, but then those different chambers have different types of functions in each of them. All right, so their territory. So female prairie dogs, they usually never leave their area. They are the ones that stay, they raise the kids, they're there pretty much their whole life. They have site fidelity, so something that they don't really move. They don't usually disperse after their birth. But then when or before they become sexually mature, male prairie dogs usually disperse away from their birth area. This helps with inbreeding. So if you are related to all your brothers and sisters, you do not want to mate with them. So you go find some other territory and another male prairie dog comes in. So give that genetic diversity around there. This all sounds great, but there definitely is territory disputes. This can escalate into a contact fight. So two prairie dogs engage, they scratch each other, they claw, they bite. Sometimes they even have visible injuries when they leave. And then each clan has about 2 dominant males who hold the territory and the burrow sites. Losing that territory could be detrimental to that prairie dog. So we've all seen those nature documentaries where like a male lion comes in and they fight, and then the loser goes away and doesn't get to mate and doesn't get those resources and doesn't get to be a part of that pride. Very same characteristics with our prairie dogs. So they lose their resources, they lose access to mating, they lose their house, they lose their family, all of these things. But again, that strongest prairie dog is the one that can protect that colony, and he is then the one to mate with all the females. So there's drama. Most territory disputes, however, do not get to that level of contact fighting. Usually they have this like long, what's called a hostile kiss. They chase each other away, they run away, and then that person's like, or that prairie dog's like, okay, I'm satisfied, you're out of here. I clearly won. This can last anywhere from like 2 minutes to a couple hours, and that prairie dog might try again. So until they cross paths, during that time, they will chase each other away. Usually it doesn't get to the point where they're fighting, but it does happen. The yearling males usually don't mate. So they will disperse to their second year, and then usually they're the ones that kind of suffer this harassment from the other adults because at that time they just want to mate and they don't want any other competition in that area. All right, so there are predators. So prairie dogs are smaller, they're rodents. A lot of animals feed on them. They have a lot of predators in these grassland areas. It could be anything from a bull snake, prairie rattlesnake, raptors, golden eagles eat them, ferruginous hawks like literally are on the ground running after them, coyotes, badgers, weasels, even the black-footed ferret. Not Nebraska, but black-footed ferrets are one of those. I love this photo because badgers to me are not large, but this prairie dog looks ginormous. So the fact that this badger caught that prairie dog, it looks very impressive. But one of the best known predator-prey relationships with prairie dogs is the black-footed ferret. So at one time, if you're not familiar, black-footed ferrets were pretty much known to be extinct. They were called extinct for a while, and then all of a sudden in Wyoming, some lady's dog brought her one and dropped it on her doorstep. It was dead, and she was like, "Oh my God, what is this? It's a black-footed ferret." And so they found a very small population. It was like less than 20 individuals, and they've kind of bounced back through conservation efforts and breeding. So it's been a success story. But one of the things we have to understand is understanding prairie dog behavior, the dynamics. That will also help us with understanding black-footed ferrets and making them successful. So basically, you can't have black-footed ferrets without prairie dogs. They're one of the huge predators of them, but that conservation goes hand in hand and they're essential to each other. All right, if you're not familiar what a black-footed ferret looks like, here's one. So Nebraska was known historically to have them. They were all over kind of that Midwest area because there were so many prairie dogs, but then the shrinking number of prairie dogs also were the shrinking number of their predators. Their main prey is prairie dogs. So it's understandable that when your prey goes, you have less individual. So here's a black-footed ferret. And I have one more picture just because they're super cute. But here's our black-footed ferret. All right. And then let's talk a little bit about their mating system and reproduction. All right, so mating system, this is a super also dramatic time in the prairie dog world. It lasts about 2 to 3 weeks in the early spring, usually around late March. During that time, each female goes into estrus or is sexually reproductive or receptive only one day and only a few hours within the day. So males have to take that opportunity to be able to then pass on their genes. Because that territoriality features really like high during this time, males do not really they're not really active, but they're exceedingly aggressive towards one another at that time. So they do have this harem, polygynous mating system, basically where that single dominant male has access to the rights to the reproductive females, very similar to like an elk group. A lot of groups of animals, a lot of taxa see this as well. Black-tailed prairie dog females usually don't mate within their first year, but in other species they do. Most yearling females do not go into estrus their first year and will mate their second year. So again, it depends on the species on how they're whether they're going to mate to that year or not. But basically, prairie dogs are rodents, and when we think of rodents, we think of mice and rats, and they have this humongous breeding system. So they can have 7 babies and then turn around 6 weeks later and have more 7 babies. So for a rodent, prairie dogs do not have that really. They don't have that high level of reproduction like other rodents. So it's a very narrow window that they have to mate with each other. And if they don't successfully breed, that's something that could be an issue. But they usually only have 1 brood a year, which is very rare for rodents, considering, again, mice are very different than prairie dogs. All right, so what about this childcare? So once they've mated, the mothers start gathering this nesting material, which is usually just dry grass. They bring it into their burrows and it increases their gathering behavior for the period of their pregnancy. During gestation, the nursery kind of preparation phase, female prairie dogs are really hostile towards one another. So you have a lot of drama when you live with prairie dogs, apparently. But the rearing of the offspring falls entirely on the mother. They can have anywhere from 1 to 7 babies, with an average being about 4 to 5 that are born per litter. So what happens is there's a lot of territory disputes. This is my area. Sometimes there's even contact fighting within the females. And then about 5.5 weeks after birth, the prairie dogs are finally ready to emerge from their nursery burrows. However, they're not fully weaned when they do come up for the first time upon that emergence. But at any time after birth, the juveniles have emerged. The mother may need to transfer the burrow. So if she believes that the burrow has been compromised or there's a bad smell or a predator's been in her burrow, she will move her babies. And I can't remember the quote that I read, but it was something about apparently mom prairie dogs don't count their offspring. They just hope that they come back and forth enough to be like, okay, I think that's good. I got them all. I can't remember the quote I read, but basically they don't count their offspring. It's just like, I'm just going to keep moving them and I'm gonna come back one time. If I don't see any more, I believe that's good. So she might leave some behind, but she might not at the same time. But I swear they're good moms. All right, so here's little baby prairie dogs. Here's what they look like. They're tiny and they're cute. They are black tails, as you can see the little tiny black tail on them. They have a lot of play behavior at this time, just like any other babies or juveniles. They watch a lot of other prairie dogs. So when we think about this, they're social, they're extroverts, very not me, but they're prairie dogs that they learn a lot from each other. They have play behavior, they somersault, they wrestle, they learn to mount each other. Basically, this is helping them survive. So they're teaching everything versus play. They're watching other prairie dogs within their colony. This is how they learn those skills of survival. All of these things are very important interactions because as adults, this is how they get to survive. So they learn both those friendly and those hostile things as well. All right, one of the things that I found that was kind of interesting with prairie dogs, and a lot of other animals do this as well, so they have cannibalism and they also eat their infants. So the killing of juveniles in their first year, that infanticide, so basically black-tailed prairie dogs do it, Utah prairie dogs do it, Gunnison's prairie dogs do it. So basically it could be before they have emerged or after that first emergence is typically the mother or sometimes the males will basically kill their young or kill other young and then eat them. So it sounds very awful. We'll get to that. The activity of eating the other one of your same species is known as cannibalism. It's most commonly found in the black-tailed prairie dog populations. The killer is most often a lactating female who's in that same area. The opportunity to do this, it really depends on the behaviors. It's depends on the typical behavior of the clan and the colony, and of course, those individual mothers as well. Why is this a thing? So it benefits. The cannibalism has been really well studied in black-tailed prairie dogs. Basically, this happens, it's most often a female that's genetically related to and lives in the same territory as the victim's mom. So why kind of do they do this? By basically by killing the unprotected litter, the prairie dog that does this gains that assistant and then also moves on from her loss in a few days. So it kind of comes back to like lions. So if you ever think about, there's many different reasons that they do this, but lions are one of those that if a rival male comes in and he defeats that male that's already there, he will move in and he often will kill the cubs to put the females back in estrus so that he can mate with them and produce his own litter. So it sounds very awful in humans when we think about this, but it also has a chance to remove those future competitors, especially in this small little community. It's increased sustenance, so there's proteins and nutrients that come from cannibalizing that carcass. Also, the victim mothers, they become better helpers. So it shifts that focus from the offspring back to the community of the prairie dogs. And then those mothers that lost an infant, they're less likely to kill again. So there's, again, disadvantages and advantages. And one of the things I want to hone in on is that this sounds awful. And I'm sure you're like, oh my gosh, why do prairie dogs do this? That sounds terrible. So prairie dogs aren't humans, and we can't put that emotional focus on those animals because they're not human. So if a human did this, awful. But if a prairie dog does this, there's reasons. So there's no emotions, there's morality as humans understand them. Being an environmental educator, it's sometimes hard to not put that anthropomorphism. So giving them human traits, for instance, when you name your dogs, very different. It's a great way to connect to people. If you show them a snake and say the snake is Petey, but then understanding at the same time that those educational efforts should focus on the biology and the ecology of those animals. So even though we want to put emotions to them and say, oh my gosh, that's terrible, there's reasons that they do it, and clearly that they've survived for this long and it's working for them. All right, last kind of big thing I want to talk about is communication. So their voice is a tool. So they have these huge range of vocalizations that they use to communicate with others in their community. And so basically to live in this colony, you have to have communication, letting them know it's both visual and auditory. And also one of the things is they have about 11 different calls, and it's been very well studied in prairie dogs. So we talked about this earlier, the jump yip. So this is seen in black-tailed prairie dogs. It's a very unique display. It's visual and auditory, so they move and also make sound. But basically they jump up their front feet, they stretch vertically, and then they let out two distinct barks. When a prairie dog does this, it's either startled by movement nearby. For instance, if there's like a snake, if their animal's running away from a snake, there's accompanied by foot thumping. Immediately after that predator has been perceived, or that danger has passed, they will do it again to let the rest of the colony know that, hey, we're safe now. If you ever come up on a prairie dog town, you will probably hear this quite a bit. And then they'll like duck into their hole if you come too close. But they do that really, really interesting communication tactic using the jump yip is what we call it. All right, so their language. So there's a guy who has studied prairie dog language for about 30 years. Basically, he started a study after other scientists reported that ground squirrels had different calls to each of flying predators like hawks and eagles versus predators on the ground. So they were able to establish a communication system so unique and so different that they make a different noise if it's a flying predator or a predator on the ground. And he goes, I think prairie dogs also do that. They're part of the ground squirrel family. So he studied prairie dogs. He did this for like 30 years, and he found that those animals, prairie dogs, they have a huge bunch of different calls that can even include coyotes, domestic dogs, and humans. So this is really interesting because a lot of people think prairie dogs are dumb, they're rodents, but he was able to trap a bunch of prairie dogs, and he used fur dye to understand which one was which, and then he recorded the animals' calls when different predators walked through. So the patterns were so distinct, he said that human visitors that went to a prairie dog town typically heard them within 2 hours. He also noticed that the animals made slightly different calls for individual species that went by. So the prairie dogs are basically saying, it's not just a predator, it's a badger, it's a coyote, it's a person. It gets better. It changed by the color of what the people were wearing. So he said, he asked the question, what if they described physical features to each predator? So his team started looking at this as well. And so him and his team, they basically did experiments where they changed different colors of their shirt and the sizes of the various humans wearing them. And he walked them through the colony. And they studied those calls. And basically they were able to say that prairie dogs make distinct calls for the size and the shape of the human, whether the human was wearing colors or shapes like triangles and circles. They also crammed so much of this chirp and information in, it only lasts about 1/10 of a second. So in 1/10 of a second, they can say there's a tall, thin human wearing blue shirt walking across the colony slowly. So they say all that information in less than 1/10 of a second. And all the colonies like, oh, where's that person wearing the red? I don't want them coming through. They were even able to describe whether that human once appeared with a gun. They were able to understand, I've seen that person before and they've had a gun or something that they were carrying with them. So their language is the most, when we think about dolphins and people and chimpanzees, besides people, their language is the most complex out of any of those animals. So we give a lot of credit to dolphins and chimpanzees, which we did and we should. Prairie dogs should be right up there. Their language and the amount of information that they can describe to their colony is out of this world. All right, so really quick, last thing I'm going to talk about is just their conservation and then some of the issues that people have had with prairie dogs. So conservation history before the 1800s, before the colonization of the US, prairie dog numbers were in the billions. However, when ranchers, farmers, people became from Europe became to the advancement of the United States, they were considered something that was underfoot. They were in the way. People did not like them. So for 200 years, ranchers, farmers, developers, local federal agencies, they used a lot of methods to clear prairie dogs. So they shot them, they trapped them, sometimes they were poisoned. Basically adding all this to the persecution of them, the loss of the range from human encroachment, habitat pollution. Prairie dogs have not had a great run. Things now, they're also like disease and climate change, invasive species, all these things that are putting more pressure on prairie dogs is something that they've had to deal with in the past and now the future as well. So why should we care so much about a rodent? They are known to be a keystone species. So all species should be considered irreplaceable, as all species are. However, keystone species are a species that really helps however many other species. So without this species, without prairie dogs, we wouldn't have the burrows. We wouldn't have anywhere for salamanders or snakes to live. There wouldn't be a food source for things like golden eagles and ferruginous hawks. Without them, they wouldn't turn the soil and we wouldn't have so many good foraging and grassland areas. So they do a lot of good. They believe, scientists have kind of come to the conclusion, anywhere from about 136 to about 150 species depend on the prairie dog. So if all our prairie dogs are gone, those 136, 150 other species are probably going to go too. So research has shown that prairie dogs have a positive effect on soil and plants. So they burrow, they increase, and they move through the soil. They increase that fertility. They control invasive species. Their burrows also provide tons of living areas for a number of animals, anything from burrowing owls to badgers, to snakes, salamanders. Also, when we talk about them, they are predators and scavengers. They also have a really good relationship with that black-footed ferret. So if we don't control and help prairie dogs, we're not going to have black-footed ferrets. They also disturb the landscape in a good way. And when we mess up that natural disturbance, we're going to start losing species. One of the things I've also heard is a lot of ranchers, a lot of farmers, agricultural people do not like prairie dogs because of things, rumors that have been going around for a long time and just kind of just some stereotypes about prairie dogs is that horses and cows step in the burrows and they break their legs. Many ranchers have seen them as a threat to some of their businesses and their agencies, and they often question motives of federal agencies and state agencies that try to protect them. Many claim that cows and horses break their legs in the prairie dog holes. Larry Rittenhouse of Colorado State University, I want to get this correct here. He said it would be almost impossible for a cow to break its leg in a prairie dog hole. He said, quote, "I study these animals' behavior. They are extremely adept at placing their feet," meaning those cows and horses. "In my 50 years around cows and horses, I have never seen a cow or a horse break their leg in a prairie dog town." Basically, he's saying that they're not that dumb. They're not going to stick their leg down a prairie dog hole and break it. So that can just be done right now. Bison, cows, pronghorn, we've all done studies on them. It shows specifically that they graze in areas with prairie dogs because they found that the area where the prairie dogs turn the soil, that grass and those plants are really highly nutritious. There's a significant increase in the protein content where the plants are growing and also in those prairie dog towns. All right, something that prairie dogs also have to deal with is we've all heard of the Black Death and the plague. It was caused by fleas in the earliest 20th century. It made its way here to the United States. So it's a very fast-acting organism, and it can decimate entire colonies of populations of prairie dogs. So the plague will survive in flea populations, which prairie dogs can get. It can manifest in several forms. Sometimes you might have heard of the bubonic plague. That's the one that's concerned to prairie dogs, as well as black-footed ferrets. If you think about it, they're eating them. That's something that they also have to worry about. So like I mentioned, this plague can wipe out entire colonies of prairie dogs in a matter of days to weeks. That was one of the disadvantages we talked about, is living so close together, is that disease transfer. People say that, oh, they'll get over it. They can adapt to it over time. It's a non-native organism, so it's not from the United States. So they don't physically have the ability to combat that because it's a non-native organism. Their body just wasn't meant to prepare for that. One thing we also have to look at too is a lot of other rodents. Squirrels have been found to have this as well, groundhogs, black-footed ferrets, all those different things as well. All right, so where do prairie dogs stand in Nebraska? So as a North American animal, every species of the prairie dog has gone through some type of review for a listing, either as threatened, endangered, or even at risk under that Endangered Species Act, which was administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the ones that are not listed, which is the one that we have in Nebraska, the black-tailed prairie dog, the white-tailed, and the Gunnisons, they are not listed at all. The Utah prairie dog is listed as threatened. The Mexican prairie dog is listed as endangered. A huge portion of that is because we just simply don't have data. There's insufficient data for really saying how many do we have, what's going on. That's a lot of it, but they are at this time still considered endangered. In Nebraska, the Nebraska Game and Parks is the state wildlife agency, so we manage all of the wildlife species for the public, manage them on your behalf. We do not manage them as a game species, so to quote our small game guide, residents do not need a permit to hunt. Non-residents need a small game permit. They are considered a species that you can hunt statewide year-round. There's no bag limits and there's no possession limits. So you can, there's no possession limits, there's no bag limits, there's no season on them. So for a resident, just like coyotes, we do not manage coyotes or prairie dogs as game species. You can hunt as many as you want and whenever time of year you want. All right. So that was a lot of information and 53 minutes, I told you. So yeah, 52 minutes. So hopefully you learned a lot about prairie dogs today. I tried to hit both sides. And if you really like Science Of, this was our last one for the year. So have a great holiday, everybody. We will be back in January. So I have all the topics listed here. A couple of those actually have changed. So get ready for some fun ones. But every single day that we have listed on there is a Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. So very similar to what we've been doing, but there'll be some new topics. We'll just do them once a month throughout the year. Same, it will be on Zoom. They'll have different registration links, that kind of thing. So if you really like this, we have a ton of educational videos from Science Of. We have about 87 videos online. We have our wildlife education Facebook. We have our Instagram that you can follow for more information. And then we also have our website as well. And then thanks everyone. We will see you in 2025. I'm going to really quick put my email in the, I think I can chat you, but I don't think you can chat me. Oh, I can't chat you. Okay. I will send an email to everyone that's here today. You'll get my email anyway. So if you have questions, you can contact me. Otherwise, hopefully we will see all of you in January. Have a great rest of your year. And thank you everyone for seriously promoting and supporting Science Of. I really appreciate it spending time with me. I hope you've learned a lot this year and we'll see you in January. So thanks everyone. Have a great day.